Let me introduce myself. I'm Sheila Blum, and I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of the town's Climate and Environment Committee to our Earth Month EcoFest on native plants and sustainable landscaping. We're very glad that you're here and hope that you enjoy learning about the benefits of native plants and what each of us can do wherever you are on the spectrum of native plant use, whether you're totally new, whether you've dipped your toes in, or whether you're quite experienced. So why does our committee want to spread the word on native plants? Well, for one thing, Maryland and our entire country are rapidly losing birds, butterflies, bees, and other important pollinators, which are crucial to the health of our ecosystem. Everything is connected, as we hear so often. I'm sure you know some of the reasons for this, this loss of our pollinators and birds. Help me out. Like, what have you heard? What do you think one of the problems might be? Pesticides and herbicides. Thank you, Ken. Anything else? Habitat loss. Yes. Yes. Invasive plants or loss of lack of necessary
lack of milkweed and other natives that monarchs and other.
Very good. Yep. Climate change, of course. Too many what? We plant too many non-natives. Thank you. Non-native shrubs, trees, and flowers. So we've been conditioned to think that we need certain kinds of yards, large weed-free lawns, plants that originated in Asia or Europe, whether we know it or not, leaf-free lawns, or yards, but we have to change our thinking. Native plants are essential because they are the foundation of healthy local ecosystems. These native plants have evolved over thousands of years together with local birds and pollinators to thrive in our environmental conditions. So natives provide vital food, shelter, and breeding habitat for local wildlife. They also conserve water, reduce the need for pesticides and fertilizers, and prevent soil erosions. So one important thing we have to take away, I think, is that landscaping as usual won't work. We have to try some different things than we've done before. Our speaker today, Drew Asbury, will share his expertise on how we can each make impactful changes and what he has done himself. I think we'll be inspired to learn and hear what he's done. Drew is a horticulturalist with 30 years of experience. We can see his current work at Montgomery County's wonderful Brookside Gardens. Prior to that, he worked for many years at another local favorite, Hillwood Estate. His credentials also include a Master of Professional Studies in Sustainable Landscape Design from GW University. We look forward to learning from him about the vital importance, benefits, and even beauty of native plants, and especially how he transformed his typical suburban yard into one that plays an important role in transforming or supporting the local ecosystem. Hold your questions. We'll have a Q&A period at the end of his talk, but then the fun won't be over because we'll be drawing the raffle prizes and then some other things that I'll tell you about in the Q&As, but I'll just stop now and turn it over to our speaker, Drew Asbury.
So the whole idea today is really to showcase different sustainable techniques that can create a more sustainable garden. And to do that, I'm going to take you on a little tour of my property that I've been developing for the past 14 years. When I arrived 14 years ago, I inherited a fairly traditional garden or conventional garden. And I myself, 14 years ago, was quite a conventional gardener. This is what I inherited at the get-go. A few random scattered planting beds around the property, that ubiquitous evergreen line of shrubs along the front of the house. Very fortunate to inherit in the backyard a couple large canopy native trees. But otherwise, a few odds and ends here and there, but we're really looking at 95% of the property was covered in lawn. So here I am, probably about years 3 or year 4, working in the garden. There's no master plan for this space whatsoever. It was literally one impulsive project after another. I did have a wish list of plants that I knew, I jotted down, I have to have this, I have to have that. So I would go to the garden center, right? And perhaps I would review that list, but, really I was looking for bargains, right? As all gardeners do. But basically anything that took my eye. So perhaps, one day this, dwarf Korean white pine. That's not showing up well on that screen, but blue pine over there, right? That was the impulse of the day. I would get home, unload the car, right, with all my new goodies, and then I'd have to walk around the yard figuring out, now, where am I going to put this? Okay. Does this sound familiar to anyone else, right? Luckily, what I did know from the very beginning, what I wanted to do was to create these really deep beds that wrapped around the entire perimeter of the garden, with the idea of creating, basically blocking out the outside world, screening out the neighbors, and creating this little inner oasis that was just for me. Okay. But then when the light bulb moment came to my life in 2018, I went back to school at George Washington. So this was 6 years after moving in, and worked on a degree in sustainable landscape design. And little did I know the impact that program was going to have, particularly on the way that I felt about myself and my role as a gardener. During that program, I got a much deeper understanding of the biodiversity crisis that we're in, that Sheila's already commented on, right? The decline in birds, the decline in insects, both globally, but also right in our own backyards. I started going out into natural lands with folks that knew what they were looking at, and learning about native plant communities, and also learning, right, the tens or hundreds of thousands of years that our native plant communities have co-evolved along with all the local wildlife, and of course the interrelated dependence that those two have on one another. And then to pull it all together for me, introducing myself to Doug Tallamy. This is his book, Nature's Best Hope, which I believe is a raffle prize, completely uncoordinated here today, truly. But this is my my only book recommendation for you today. And for me, this book not so much told me how to do things, but why it was necessary for me to change my ways from being a more conventional gardener to a more sustainable gardener. So I can't recommend this book enough. But these all these things coalesce together at the same time into my light bulb moment. And I don't think I'll ever be able to be the gardener that I once was. So for me, the mission of the Garden at Home became very clear, right? The garden's mission now is to create as many homes for as many living creatures as I possibly can fit onto a half-acre property. The house is for me, that's where I live. The garden is for everybody here, and I want to make it as healthy and as a vibrant ecosystem for all of these little critters here. So, yeah, so I love bunnies, right? 3 bunnies out in the yard at the same time. Oh my God, where's the camera, right? So, so what did I do, right? I just started by planting more native plants in the existing beds that I had already created, right? That was an easy way to get started. Work from Doug Tallamy shows us that a garden composed of about 70% native plant material is about as ecologically functional as a garden with 100% native plant material. So at least for me initially, that was a big lofty goal to shoot for, but that was my goal. I think after a dozen years or so, I'm finally only about at that 70% threshold. But what this is nice for us home gardeners, especially during the transitional phase. At first, I could keep my those blue and purple plants, that's catmint and salvia, right? Non-natives. They could be allowed to stay in the garden as I was adding in other native plants, trialing things out. I did a lot of ones of this and one of that just to start seeing how do these native plants grow on my property and how could I use them in a garden design. Now, around 2020 is when I graduated, and y'all remember 2020, I had a lot of time on my hands, as we all did at the house, and I probably got a little overly ambitious. I started running out of room in my existing beds, so I started removing a lot of the non-natives that I had just planted 5 years before. So this was a proud moment. And again, get out the camera. Big pile of Korean spice viburnums there on the left were removed and replaced with the right there are Fothergilla gardeniae, a native substitute, I suppose. So the garden today, right, fast forwarding, a lot of the original elements that I planted in my conventional garden days still remain as my backbone of my garden. There's that same blue Korean pine there. But moving forward, I'm committed to working almost exclusively with native plants. And then even more important is combining that with a sustainable maintenance regime for my property at home. So this is kind of what we're going to talk about today, right, is these practical strategies for a more sustainable garden. We're going to look at a lot of specific design techniques. I'm going to highlight a lot of specific native plants and native plant combinations for a variety of site conditions. And then we're going to wrap up today with a whole little section just about how we can maintain our gardens with a bit more of a sustainable frame of mind. But here's the deal. I think Sheila already kind of hinted at this. I'm going to guess everybody in this room is already on a sustainable journey, right? A lot of these techniques will work better in some gardens rather than others. I'm just hoping to share what's worked well for me over the years and hoping to inspire you today to think maybe a little bit differently about your own garden this afternoon when you go home and walk around your space. Okay, so moving on to our first location on our garden tour today, we're going to talk about the front stoop and the front walkway. You know, when I originally arrived, that little weeping cherry tree was dead as a doornail. So I basically just inherited old azaleas, yews, and clipped hollies along the front of the house. And you see a few stepping stones were set in amongst the lawn that led from the front door to the driveway. And then otherwise, mostly just lawn. This is a pretty sunny location, flat, average soils, and again, mostly lawn to get started. So here we are just a few years in, and our first design technique today, which is printed all over the walls here, is this idea of reducing the size of our lawn, right, and converting that lawn into a planting bed, okay? Super simple idea. So this is what I did. I pulled that bed out from that line along the front of the house, repurposed slate that was scattered around the property with the idea of creating a walkway that would force myself, but plus all my visitors to the house, to walk through a garden from the driveway to the front door. And then basically I just started working with what I had. In the backyard, there was green hosta, green iris, and green liriope. At the time, I dug those up, divided it, moved an azalea to the front yard. I was just trying to fill those beds initially with something better than what I had before. But a bit luckily and a bit coincidentally, I did plant some native plants right at the get-go 14 years ago, and we're going to zoom in on these. So that little white flower, that's the clethra, a purple foliage bush in the background is the physocarpus, and then a little green haze off to the right of the black-eyed Susan is Amsonia. And we're going to zoom in on these three and go a little bit more in detail here. So I have a lot of favorite plants. I'm sure everyone in this room has favorite plants. Clethra hummingbird is on my short list of native plants that are on my preferred planting plant list. And here we see clethra in my garden on the right after about 10 years or so. But in general, shrubs, okay, so at home, I like big, lush gardens, but I have to develop gardens that are low maintenance, okay? That's kind of the overall driver for me. And I think shrubs in general are an underutilized category of plants because a shrub is fairly low maintenance, right? You plant it once. Once it gets established, it's going to live theoretically for many, many years. A dwarf shrub like clethra requires virtually no pruning. I virtually never touch this plant. And they're quite reliable, right? I know for me, every single July, I'm going to get really a beautiful floral display. And the real reason why I like clethra in particular is because it's by far the most fragrant plant in my entire property. And right here by the front stoop in July, this perfumes the entire air. I do not have to bend over and sniff it. It's in the entire area of the front yard. Clethras do leaf out kind of late, so I've taken advantage of that and put a wide variety of little understory ground covers. That's Phlox subulata, which is in bloom in everybody's yard right now. At this time of the year. So attracts a lot of pollinators and butterflies, but it's all about that fragrance for me. And then let's look at another shrub here. This is Physocarpus diablo. This is a purple foliage form or cultivar of our native nine bark. Here we see it gets bright white flowers in the spring, followed by really quite attractive fruit display, which the birds quickly gobble up and take all that fruit off by early summer. To me, if we're thinking about a truly hot, dry location, nine bark thrives on drought conditions, full sun, and is about 98% deer resistant. Just a really tough garden performer. But let's face it, it's our first red flag of the day, right? So I'm just going to address the red flag before we get going any further. This is a purple leaf cultivar of a native plant, which in nature is green, okay? Science is telling us now when we start changing the native plant considerably different from nature to what our garden plants are, is that there's a very good chance we're reducing the ecological value of this particular native plant, okay? Insects see color differently than us humans. So the question is, will insects recognize this as a nine bark and as a host plant, right? Now, I'll tell you, those birds strip those fruit really quickly, so I don't think the birds are gonna mind. But for me, the purple foliage still adds a lot of charm and whimsy and a spark of color to an otherwise green landscape. And I meet with a lot of clients, and one of the most common plants that has purple foliage in a lot of landscapes, anybody want to take a guess? Purple barberry, Japanese barberry, tier 1 invasive plant species in the mid-Atlantic. So to me, that purple foliage needs to go. And if you're dying to have purple foliage in your yard, maybe a purple leaf Physocarpus is a much more suitable alternative. And there's dwarf forms too. A little tiny wine is one that only gets about the size of this podium or so. Okay, our third native highlight to get us started. This is not a shrub. This is a perennial. This is Amsonia hubrichtii, known as Arkansas blue star. For me, I think of this plant as a shrub, though, when I want to design it and place it in the garden. And that's because, like a shrub, this takes 3, 4, maybe 5 years to fully get established and get some size to it. Because the first few years, it's putting out a massive root system and getting itself very well established. So if truly low maintenance was your number one driver for your garden, please include Amsonia, 100% drought resistant. Full sun is perfectly, that's what it does best in. And this is 100% deer resistant. So blue flowers in the spring, amazing fall color. And there in the middle picture, that's 3 plants after about 12 years. So it makes a really large mass. I never touch these except for around April 1st. I go out, take my shears and chop down last year's stems. Otherwise, you never have to touch Amsonia. So, okay, so our second design technique, if the first design technique is to remove the lawn, turn it into a planting bed, then the second idea is then fill that bed with native plants, okay? Here's a super simple scenario. Again, I've said low maintenance about 8 times now. But this, if I had done this 14 years ago, this would be so easy to maintain now, 14 years down the road. One of the criticisms we hear a lot with native gardens, right, is that they're wild and untamely and it's out of control, right? We hear that all the time. So what are some ways that we can do to kind of tone down the messiness of the native garden, right? We can keep a fairly simple plant palette. I've only worked with 3 species here. I've also kept the existing evergreens that came with the house, right? So super easy. We can also choose plants that tend to be a little shorter or more in control. Both the clethra and the Amsonia mature to waist high, right? So even 15 years down the road, I'm not going to have 8-foot tall plants blocking the front of the house here. And then if we can plant things in masses, right, groupings, all of a sudden we get a little bit more of a little bit more simplicity in our planting, a little bit more calmness here. And then if there's ways that we can repeat masses and throughout that same garden area, then all of a sudden we've got a lot of intentionality of design there and something that people recognize as a design space as opposed to the wild and exuberant native pollinator garden look. Okay, so, but let's face it, if this had been the planting plan, perhaps this would be a little bit boring those first 4 or 5 years. You're going to have a lot of little green meatballs of plants getting started. And we're going to be looking at a sea of mulch, okay? So maybe we could incorporate just a couple more species to really jazz up the color and the vibrancy and all this. So these are 3 plants that I'm referring to as prolific self-seeders. And I also call them short-lived perennials. And so for me, so pink is the echinacea, yellow is black-eyed Susan, penstemon is the white flower there. For me, if I can keep individual specimens of these 3 alive for 4 or 5 years, I think I'm doing pretty good, right? These plants put virtually no energy into their root system, okay? Which is what you do when you need to have reserves for bad times, right? Instead, these plants grow, they kind of have that live hard, die young mentality. So they grow very quickly, lushly. They bloom their heads off from year 1. And then all of those heads turn into really, they produce a ton of seed, okay? And then that seed is scattered around the garden. And when it's happy, it will sprout all over different areas of the garden. That's how it's going to keep itself in the environment in the long run, right? It's constantly rejuvenating itself by sowing around. But there's tricks to this, right? If we're out there deadheading all of our flowers and not allowing seed heads to remain upright during the wintertime, right? We got to keep the seed in the garden. Then if we're out there doing the traditional applications of hardwood mulch, right? People put down mulch to prevent weeds from growing in the garden. Well, you also prevent all your reseeding perennials from reseeding if you're putting down too much mulch, right? And then, of course, as gardeners, we also have to learn to identify the seedlings. If we're extremely meticulous and we're out weeding everything and we don't know what the seedlings look like, we may be removing these from the garden, right? So, but a side benefit of these is that when you produce a ton of seed, the birds know that you've got a ton of seeds in those seed heads. And echinacea and black-eyed Susans in particular are really, really, top of the list for goldfinches in particular, but all songbirds really appreciate these 3 in the garden. So perhaps early on, right, I could have done something like this. I would have had those initial 3, the 2 shrubs in the Amsonia, which would be the long-term anchor plants for this garden. And I could have intermingled in these 3 quick flashy plants. Penstemon blooms in May, echinacea blooms in June, black-eyed Susans bloom in July. So I've got 3 months of color here. Big, bright color, again, but repeated in masses, okay? Still super simple to maintain. Over the years, as the Amsonian shrubs grow, these numbers will decrease over time, but by then, because they just get pushed out of the way, but by then, they have sowed themselves all around other little corners of the garden and showing up in the cracks of the sidewalk and other places where you never intended them to be, okay? So another design technique to consider incorporating, Sheila mentioned this as well, right? The basic definition of habitat is food, shelter, and water. Food's going to come from the native plants. Shelter is going to come from how we put those native plants together. But water is water. So for me, I would recommend to put a water feature in your garden where you get to enjoy it as much as wildlife. For me, that is right along the front walkway to the front door. The window in the background is also my living room window. So I get to look out. This is me filming from inside the living room, looking out at the birds. The cats really like this positioning too at the house. So, but that diagram there shows what I think, I'm sorry, cats? Only indoor cats. I'm not going to fall into that trap here. So they're indoor only. But these types of water features that have a large underground reservoir of water, to me, again, I'm all about low maintenance. To me, this keeps 95% of the water under the ground, shaded, dark, cool, clean, algae-free, and then only a little bit of water is pumped up with a pump to be exposed on the top at one time. I clean this out 3 or 4 times a year. I pump out the water, I flush it out a couple times, and I refill it back up. And from March to December, this is running in my yard. And I do turn it off in January and February when it's truly the coldest times of the year. So yeah, think about adding some water, and it really brings in the wildlife. So for me, month of July, hearing that water and smelling the clethra in the air, and then watching something like Senna marylandica here, this yellow flower, grow from 0 inches to 6 feet tall over a 2-month period. It's a host plant for sulfur butterflies. To me, this is so much more exciting than any old azalea or clipped holly or boxwood. So I ultimately removed most, I think actually all of the original existing evergreens there in favor of something more dynamic and exciting in the long run. Okay, everyone, first stop is done. We're going to move on to our second example here of creating a more sustainable landscape. What I refer to as the hedgerow. That was not the original design intentions here. The number one design intention was to screen the view from where I'm standing into my neighbor's yard, and to screen their view because they also had a raised deck off the back of the house that they could see right into my yard. And then that hideous fence there had to get screened. So that was really the main driver initially. But part shade, this gets eastern sunlight, morning sun, and then afternoon shade because of the 2 big trees in the neighbor's yard. A little bit of a slope terrain. I did have some erosion and stormwater issues here. The entire driveway drained down into this side of the yard. But again, fairly average soils. And then I just returned from one of those impulsive buying trips here, right from the very beginning. This was also an area, right? This was all lawn when I arrived. So we've already fast forwarded to removing the lawn, making a planting bed. What I did initially was devoting the back 6 to 8 feet of the border solely for evergreen plants that would perform that screening job that I was which was the main driver for the design. If I knew what I know now back then, I would have probably still created something very similar to this, the scale of the bed initially, but I would have used native evergreens as my backbone. So perhaps I could have done something like this. These are 3 of my favorite evergreen natives to use for screening. On a hot, sunny, or dry location, my go-to is Juniperus virginiana or eastern red cedar. For a shady location, like underneath the neighbor's towering canopy trees there, I like using American holly, Ilex opaca. And then if I need a little bit of extra sparkle or a little, focal plant, I really like the dwarf cultivar Little Gem of our southern magnolia. And I would also recommend, I wish 14 years ago, I had just started with little saplings, particularly of the juniper and the American holly. Little 2 or 3 foot tall plants, study after study has shown those plants get established a lot quicker, and ultimately they end up being bigger and quicker trees. You just have to be patient the first 4 or 5 years while you have a sapling in the yard, but the end results are beneficial. So instead of spending time searching out big specimens, I probably would actually spend more time searching out female cultivars because both the juniper and the American holly come in males and females, right? Only females are going to have the berries. And you can go to garden centers and find female Eastern red cedars and female American hollies so that then you're assured to have that fruit display. There's enough males in the world and the surrounding environment to pollinate those females for sure. But if you want that awesome berries, go with some females. Okay, now here's the issue. Again, just kind of like the front yard, I just recommend to create really big, deep beds and to put little saplings in it. Like, what could I do to fill that sea of mulch? And you could see my traditional gardening ways back in the day. Look at how much mulch is there. There's not a weed in sight. There's not a leaf there. And look at that lawn. We'll get back to the lawn, but I was not a sustainably minded gardener when I had the perfect lawn was part of the goal. Okay. So for a moment, we're going to take a field trip to across the street to my neighbors. They asked for some help. They said, Drew, we want to do a little screening of our neighbor in that White House there. And also their house is oriented so that at night headlights would shine up through and into their bedroom windows. So the idea was to screen. They had like $20 was their budget. Like they virtually had no budget. Okay. So what we did here is this was all lawn. We created a planting bed. We put in 3 baby junipers virginianas. They were only 1-gallon pots, about knee high or so. And then we filled it with what I'm referring to as robust native perennials and grasses. Okay. These are the big bang for your buck plants. Okay. I love Panicum virgatum northwind. It's my favorite native grass. If I'm looking for a grass about as tall as I am, great native alternative to the invasive miscanthus grasses, which is in about every other yard, the Japanese maiden grass. Invasive plant. Now you have a native alternative. And then Solidago rugosa fireworks. There's so many goldenrods out there. This fireworks cultivar is by far my favorite. But what these plants do by being robust is they're going to form large masses in the garden, which is great to fill up volume, especially early on, or in places where we're removing lawn and we create these big open spaces. What do we fill them with, right? To me, I think of plants like this. So this photo on the left, so this was planted in May of 23, and the photo on the left is September of 24, so about a year and 4 months later. And then the photo on the right is the September of 25, so about 2 years and 4 months after planting. Everything is baby little plants, is like this. Never once have I seen my neighbors out gardening. They are not gardeners, and this is thriving over there in their location. 2 more of these robust, big bang for your buck plants to consider. Aster Radon's favorite. She's a big one, 3 feet tall, 3 feet wide. And then Pycnanthemum uticum, our mountain mint. Again, great, good filler plant material. We talked about Doug Talamy earlier. He has charts showing which plants have higher ecological value than other natives. When it comes to herbaceous plants, the Solidago, the goldenrods, and the asters are number 1 and number 2 on that list. We talked about the declining birds. Of course, if we want to have a lot of birds, you got to have baby birds. Okay. Baby birds are fed almost exclusively caterpillars. That's their diet, right? That's what mom and dad are out picking caterpillars, jamming it down the throats of their babies. And now we realize if we want caterpillars, right, we have to have native plants, right? Native plants produce a lot more caterpillars. And then of that list, the asters and the goldenrod are the top of the list for little caterpillar factories. Okay, so 2 really important species to add to our gardens if we want to help out birds. Mountain mint, I have no idea where that falls on the caterpillar list, but for me, I think it's the plant that attracts the most widest array of diversity of pollinators in my entire property. Another good thing about all 4 of these, super easy to dig up chunks and move these, give them to friends, or move them around the garden. These are the same 4 plants I would recommend if someone were to ask, hey, we need help planting out here at the town hall or at the local library, or if it's a family member that you know is not a gardener, right? Big, robust perennials are a good option to consider, like these 4 that we're looking at. These are all sun-loving plants. So to a half a day, they could handle half a day sun perfectly fine. I would think 4 to 5 hours of sunlight is the minimum. So here, maybe 14 years ago, I could have done something like this, right? Again, this would have been super easy. This would have taken up a lot of lawn, a lot of volume. Early on, I would have had a lot of these big pollinator masses in the garden. I'm repeating the elements again to give it some intentionality of design, and a wide variety, right? So this would have filled up that bed early on. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We haven't talked about stormwater at all today, right? In a traditional garden or property, we often do whatever we can to get stormwater off of our property as quickly as we can. Now, when we're a sustainable garden, we're figuring out ways that we can capture some of the stormwater. How can we slow down stormwater? How can we capture it in some way and allow it to infiltrate into the ground to recharge our local water table? At the same time, all that stormwater that we can keep on our own property is keeping that stormwater out of our local waterways, which of course are highly degraded from all of our stormwater runoff. So here we are, the top of the fence there is where the driveway puts a ton of water. I put in a drain, a catch basin to pipe it out, getting that stormwater away from the foundation of my house, and then releasing it here, right up here on the top, where the top of that line of rock enters. Initially, I did have a little bit of erosion issue here because I pumped so much water in here. But over time, as the plants rooted in and filled in, the ground was held. Here's a picture from today, or about last summer or so. That blue line is the squiggly little area that we just saw with the rocks and such where the water's diverted to. And coincidentally, I planted many years ago one hydrangea arborescens, straight species. This is our smooth hydrangea. And that plant was so happy with all that extra stormwater that she seeded herself all along the border there. So that shrub that looks about 5 feet tall with the bright yellowy white leaves, and that's the fall color of hydrangea arborescens. So for me, plants teach us things all the time that we never anticipate. So when you find that right niche for the right plant, just sometimes amazing things can happen in the garden. So ultimately here, this design technique is this idea of a hedgerow development, for lack of better words. A hedgerow is like a thicket. It's where so many woody plants are growing together that the woody stems start to interlock together. For me, this has created ultimately the deepest bed of my property, but also the most dense vegetation. And for me, this is also now where I see the most amount of wildlife, particularly birds darting in and out of this eclectic hedgerow environment. Over the years, in 2 successive phases, I pulled the lawn out another 2 to 3 feet at a time. And that allowed me to find room to fit in another layer of native evergreens in front of my original evergreens. So there are baby American hollies. There's a juniper now in there. Where it says magnolia, that's one of the magnolia little gems that was actually part of the original planting 14 years ago. And then since then, I've added some canopy trees, and things like the sassafras have appeared on their own in the garden. So as you develop your garden, a lot of native plants just like to appear in your garden too. And then the job of the gardener is to, put all of these pieces together and decide what stays and what goes. But for me, this density, I just enjoy seeing all the wildlife using this space in the garden. Okay, we're on to our third stop, the woodland here. When I first arrived, again, fairly sparse setting here, mostly lawn. Fortunately, the 3 trees you see were native canopy trees planted by the previous owners. Those are red maples, Acer rubromes. And so because of that, the shade, the lawn was struggling. There was areas of dry shade, but still fairly average soils, slightly sloped terrain. And it's really a woodland environment, that gives you the opportunity to go all in on really maximizing the ecological value of your property, because a woodland, you're developing all these different layers and tiers of foliage, from a canopy to an understory tree layer to a shrub layer, herbaceous layer, ground cover layer. And each one of those layers is able to support its own array of wildlife. Okay. So luckily, when I arrived, I had my Acer rubrum there already there. Coincidentally, I found 3 red buds at Lowe's on clearance one day, and I said, "Oh, got to get them." So in came the red buds, some oak leaf hydrangeas, and then in later years, assorted native herbaceous layers there. And then just really to push it all the way home here, I can't stress how much our native canopy trees, right, are truly, we talked about the caterpillar factories of goldenrod and asters, but it's the big trees in our landscapes that are the true caterpillar factories and habitat creators, especially for birds. And then this is the white oak, which stands a little bit above all the rest of our native trees. But all trees, right, they do so many good things, reducing our energy needs, reducing the heat island effect, creating habitat, filtering pollutants from the air, storing carbon, holding on to the soils and preventing erosion, right? So many good things out there. And this may be the solution. If you're in the audience today and you say, "Oh, I don't have any lawn to remove and I'm not going to change my garden and I like this, and you're in love with your existing garden. Well, maybe planting a handful, 5 or 6 saplings of native trees in amongst your azalea and rhododendron borders or your boxwood parterre, right? Maybe doing that today will become the most cherished items on your property for future generations down the road, right? And you don't have to do very much at all, but getting some little native trees stuck in your garden, boom, you're done in an afternoon, but yet you know what the potential long-term return is there on that. But let's face it, canopy trees, you have to be a little selective. A lot of us have smaller properties. This is where the benefit of small flowering trees come into play. They give a lot of the same ecological benefits of bigger trees, but they fit into smaller spaces. In my backyard right now, I love this moment in spring when the dogwood and the red buds overlap in flower. So you look out and see this pink and white haze. And then off to the right, over in the hedgerow, just as the dogwood and red buds fade out of bloom, my red buckeye Aesculus pavia burst into flower. It's bright, tropical, gaudy flowers, but yet that plant is a preferred food source for ruby-throated hummingbirds, right? And it busts into flower right at the moment that they return from their, thousands of miles long migration from Central and South America. When they come to the yard every late April, I know that red pavia will be in bloom, greeting them upon their return to our area. Okay, for the next few slides, we're going to talk about this idea of working in dry shade and to install a living mulch or a green mulch. Basically, we're looking for something that's a substitute for a sea of hardwood mulch, and we're going to use plants to create this living mulch. Now, again, if I point out here, right, there's those red maples. You can see what's growing up it. That's English ivy. When I first arrived, this whole side of the yard was nothing but a thin lawn that was 50% English ivy. So I spent a few years just removing the English ivy. But at the time, I still thought it looked kind of pretty climbing up the trees, so I left it. It's no longer climbing up the trees. But again, we're all on our own journey at different paths, right? So no, but it sets seed when it climbs up trees, and then that seed spread out into natural areas and such like that. So what we're going to look at is this idea of creating this living mulch. Okay, so again, first step, removal of those invasive ground covers. You can see the 2 red maple trunks in the background there, and I did this over a series of successive plantings. But these are 4 plants that I particularly like for a dry shade location. And all 4 of these also have an evergreen component to them, particularly the Christmas fern. That Christmas fern is my #1 go-to for dry shade. That thing is tough as nails. And then a Carex pennsylvanica. So for me, I like to mix the fern texture with a Carex texture, which is a sedge, and then intermingle different low-growing flowering ground covers. The idea, right, if we choose compatible plants, we plant them about 12 to 18 inches apart. The idea is that over time, as they grow and spread, they'll begin to knit together to form this lovely tapestry of textures and colors and such. It's easier said than done, but that's where you just stick with it and keep plugging. That Origeron Lindhaven carpet, every single year that moves higher and higher up my wish or my favorite list, because it's such a strong garden performer, particularly in shady locations. So here's the end result of creating these little carpets of color in the garden. That white daisy flower, that is the Origeron Lynnhaven carpet. I see, I'm gonna walk away because this side doesn't work. This is Phlox stolonifera here, and the other blue in the background is Phlox divaricata, a similar species. In the foreground, that's Iris cristata, lovely little low-growing iris, only grows about 3 to 4 inches tall, can handle a sunnier location as well as shade. But if I start dissecting those photos, I also start seeing lots of fern foliage coming up. I see different sedges in there, and I see a ton of our native violets, which I never had to plant violets at all. Violets make great living mulches and ground covers, right? So now I know this layer has so much more ecological value than the old traditional layer of hardwood mulch. Those were underneath 2 large mature red maples, so directly underneath. So dappled light all day, I would say. Maybe a couple hours at the very sunrise and a couple hours in sunset, but otherwise mostly shade and dry shade. What's the fun with all this, right, is a lot of these techniques start compounding when we use them together, okay? So here's the other corner of the house where I've connected the gutter to a 6-inch flexible black, pipe that's buried underground, gets it about 10 to 15 feet away from the corner of the house, and then released into this dry riverbed. This water from the gutter is directed straight at those 2 red maples. So what was once a notoriously dry spot now gets extra irrigation during weather events, and then planted it with a series of more little green evergreen ground covers. The little yellow flower, green and gold, one of my favorites and one of the easiest to dig out little pieces and move it around all the different nooks and crannies in your garden. The sedge here is the creek sedge. And then white wood aster, it's off to the very edge of the bottom right corner. If you're looking for a vigorous shade plant for a dry shade, white wood aster, she can be a little aggressive. So keep her in dry shade. Don't put white wood aster, Eurobia divaricata, in a really lush spot or she will take over. Lesson learned myself there. So what this leads me up to is these 4 plants, right? These are the 4, right? Tier 1 invasive plants in the Mid-Atlantic region. In a sustainable garden, there's no place for invasive plants. These are 4 that we commonly see used as scenarios in someone's backyard in dry shade, right? We see large swaths of these. We've talked a lot today about removing the lawn and replacing with a native bed. Now we can also look at areas where we have any of these 4 as a potential area that we can turn a negative into a positive, remove these from our gardens, and then replace with something like a living mulch, right? The problem with invasive plants, I think I'm speaking to the choir here, right, is that it's not so much it's invasive in our own yards, it's when a small piece or fragment of this ends up into natural lands like Rock Creek Park, right? There, once it gets established, it grows slowly, and it might take 5 years, it might take 50 years, but eventually it's going to form a patch the size of this room, and it's going to displace the native plant community which belongs there. So that's the big problem. And they severely reduce the ecological value of the natural lands, but also of our backyards. And then if you say, okay, I don't want that foo-foo of 12 different plants making a tapestry mixing together. If you just want one vigorous evergreen ground cover to replace your big vigorous patch of English ivy, consider Pacra aurea. This thing is a workhorse in a native garden and spreads pretty wide and far. Here in my front yard, it's mixed with birches. That's a bit of a swale along the road, so it gets wet at times, but those birches during droughts, it is bone dry there, and that Pacra grows right up to the trunks. And then the very backyard, I have an official rain garden, which is lined with Pacra aurea. That's what Pacra, that bright green glossy foliage is what Pacra looks like in the dead of winter, right? So very easy plant to dig up and share with friends and move around your garden. Okay, everyone, so we're moving on from our design side of our presentation onto the maintenance side. Putting native plants in is amazing, but if we're not maintaining our gardens through a sustainable lens, then we're really missing out on so many additional opportunities. Leaving the leaves, I see those signs are also posted around the room today, so bravo to Chevy Chase Sustainability or Environmental Committee. To me, right, the story is leaf litter, of course, makes amazing habitat, right? The east coast of North America was a lot of it was covered in leaf litter before colonizers came and did what we did. So things like the Luna moth have evolved to overwinter in the leaf litter. They drop as a caterpillar in fall. They build their cocoon amongst the leaf litter all winter, remain there all winter, and then the following spring emerge as an adult Luna moth. If we rake and pick up all of our leaves, right, we're also raking and removing all the Luna moths from our gardens. Picture on the left, to me, is that's like the ideal amount. I get asked a lot, like how many leaves, and that's a loaded question. It's it's a lot of a balancing game of playing around. But to me, those are right about now. The bright chartreuse leaves are the ostrich fern, which are coming up now. But the dark green leaves, that's that Christmas fern. That's the evergreen leaves from the previous year. It looks like this year we had a heavy snow, so they kind of got flattened out over the winter time. But then mixed with that leaf litter there, I guarantee you that is just filled with life underneath those fern fronds and leaf litter. All those little insects and arthropods and everybody else living in there. And I guarantee the birds know it too, right? Because they're going to spend all winter rooting around in that foliage mass there, searching for all those overwintering insects. Now, what we're also learning, right, is how important wood is. Rotting wood, 25% of biodiversity that lives in a woodland environment requires rotting wood to complete its life cycle. 45% of North American birds require rotting snags or trunks for nesting sites and for feeding and such like that. So whatever we can do to leave the leaves and leave the wood now. So part of this, that picture on the right is my brush pile. If you have space on your property for a brush pile, every time I walk past mine, I see life and activity in there. When we had that snowcrete covering everything for 3 or 4 weeks, I guarantee you there was little caves and little igloos underneath my huge brush pile. That was a saving grace for a lot of little wildlife this past winter. The third picture from the left there, those were those 2 red maples that we looked at earlier. About 3 years ago, I got solar panels on the house, so I had to get more sunlight. It was a sad day, but I knew in the long run, this is what I felt like that was the next step for me on my sustainable journey. But I left 12-foot tall snags in the yard to rot naturally. I now see woodpeckers and other birds regularly feeding on all the decomposing insects that are now feeding on those tree trunks. Okay. And so maybe if you have a small yard, you can't leave 12-foot snags or a huge brush pile. Even if you can just break up little branches, shove that underneath shrubs, or if you have a holly tree, somewhere where you could put it where folks or your neighbors don't see it. But I guarantee you the wildlife will thank you for that extra rotting wood and a little bit of a cover that provides for different types of species. I've got about 3 more slides. Leave the leaves, leave the wood, leave the stems, right? So this is where we used to go out in the fall. I used to chop everything down, rake all the leaves, put it all in bags and say, I've just cleaned up the garden for the year. I've put it to bed. Now I can go inside and rest for the winter. Of course, I just destroyed all that habitat that I was actively trying to grow. Now in the fall, I sit inside, I take a break. I enjoy wandering and doing garden walks, but I do very minimal work in the fall time. Here on the left, that's the clethra that we saw earlier in fall color. There's the Centimera atlantica with huge seed pods that are just, I get to watch the birds all winter getting into those seed pods. I wait till about April 1st or so, very end of March, to go out. I call it the chop and drop now, where I'm cutting down all of my stems that were left up all winter. I now chop it up into pieces, let it fall to the ground. And now that's my new version of mulching. There's very little mulching going on in my garden now because each fall I'm allowing a little bit of leaf litter to lay in the gardens. And then each spring, a little bit of these chopped up stems. And year after year, this was something that was very awkward. I think my first transitional years when I was so used to having the pristine slate of hardwood mulch, it looks odd at first. I don't know. It's like growing pains. You have to get through the first couple of years until you can get to something like this, which now I see life in that. I know there's overwintering insects in that. As that biodegrades, right, it's feeding the soil, making rich soil, feeding all the life that lives in soil, right, which hardwood mulch just doesn't do. Then 2 slides about killing the lawn. My traditional days, the photos on the left, I would take my big thing of Roundup, go out there and spray it on the lawn, and then use some mulch to put on top of it. And I knew I could plant within a week later. Nowadays, the Roundup is no longer on the, I reserve it for a couple invasive plant species, but for the lawn, I just smother the lawn. I save up cardboard, black and white newspaper, paper bags, lay lots of layers on the lawn, throw leaf litter on top, and just enough mulch to kind of hold everything down. The trick is I have to walk away for 6 months to a year to let that lawn completely smother and die before I can get into it and start planting. And then last but not least, I love that one of the first examples was too many pesticides are used in our gardens and conventional gardens. So why not the lawn that we have left? We just grow a freedom lawn, right? Conventional lawn requires lots of pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, fertilizer, extra irrigation, right? Just say goodbye to all of that, right? Embrace the dandelions and the violets. Go out and mow your yard once a week. That's a freedom lawn. Freedom lawn, particularly for the great spangled fritillary butterflies too. Their sole host plant is violets. The only thing that little caterpillar can eat are the leaves of violets. If we eradicate all of our violets, we eradicate our little great spangled fritillary butterflies. And folks, I think that is all I have for you today.
Hey, that was great, folks, wasn't it? That was so interesting and informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we see if you have any questions for Drew, I want to just take the liberty to mention 3 short things as a native plant enthusiast and who started to take some big steps in her own yard. I want to echo, lawns are dead zones. It's something that I learned. We've been propagandized to think we all have to have beautiful manicured and bring out the guys that will spread the pesticides and herbicides on our lawns. We have to reduce our lawns. You can make them smaller if you don't want to get rid of lawns entirely. Make them smaller, plant native shrubs and perennials in beds. But just make them smaller. The second thing I want to say is we can all do something. We can do a 6 by 6 foot native pollinator garden as a first step and put in some perennials and a few shrubs, perhaps native, taking some inspiration from some of the things Drew pointed out to us. I also want to say we have some terrific handouts that our committee has put together that will give you a lot of information about native plants and a whole variety of them, and give you ideas and tools to begin this journey if you're just starting or to continue. Don't forget, oak trees are really important, as was mentioned. I'm not enthusiastic about putting one in my yard. It's not so big, but if you have a large yard and space, let our town plant one of its wonderful free oak trees in your yard or another native canopy tree. And the last thing about small gardens, getting started with native plants, it's important that our neighbors or that everyone does something if at all possible. So let's encourage our neighbors, because when pollinator gardens, when native plants are connected, the benefit and importance is that pollinators, birds and pollinators, don't have far to travel or discover where additional food and shelter and habitat might be. So if everyone does something, it's really beneficial to our ecosystem.
Bravo.
Okay. Thank you for letting me say that occurred to me, but I loved hearing all the great tips and information you had in the story of what you did in your yard. So now we're going to have a Q&As, but then hang around, please, because we're going to then pull the winners of our little native plant prizes. You'll see what they are. And then also Drew is going to stay for a little while at one of these tables and answer any questions you might have or want to chat with him. And that's where you'll find the handouts. And also we'll have a couple of native plant enthusiasts from our committee who will also be at another table that you can chat with if Drew is tied up. This is your chance to learn more, ask any questions that you might have after our Q&As. So right now I'll move on to give you the microphone, Drew, and if you have any questions you'd like to ask him from that occurred during your presentation.
Does the microphone go to the...
Yeah, just back there in the blue.
Yeah, I can just project.
Perfect.
So definitely got all those invasives.
Yes.
Through
Yes.
town, and I've been hand putting it out in my yard for 4 years now.
She's a bugger.
And it's
Yeah.
dead. I don't know.
So what Lesser Celandine, tier one invasive plant, horrible invasive plant. It's a spring ephemeral. It covers the ground now and then disappears by June or so. But what it's doing, it gets about this tall and does eradicate the native plants that belong there. It really loves environments, wooded environments. Rock Creek Park is a major hangout of Lesser Celandine. At Hillwood, we were combating this, and we used the same recommendations that Rock Creek Park does. I think of Rock Creek Park's very sustainability-minded folks over there, and they've reserved, kind of like what I do now, using herbicides for a very small, short list of plants. I'm no longer using herbicides for easy-to-control annual weeds and such, but their recommendation is to use a glyphosate-based Roundup on Lesser Celandine during the moment when it is in bloom. So you only have about a 3 to 4 week period to control that with a herbicide. Digging it. I think if you had a small patch and you could dig and dig and dig, but you just said you've been doing it for 4 years in a small space, and it still comes back. So I don't know about vinegar. I just know for that one in particular, I think vinegar works great for a lot of easy to kill weeds because it's a desiccant. It dries things out. The Lesser Celandine has some type of bulblet or little a nice storage organ underneath the ground. So I don't think the vinegar would be enough.
Yes, and just on that using the Roundup, you said that it's in bloom.
Yes.
Do you really want to wait that long because by then it has the little nodules.
I just remember very specifically Rock Creek Park's recommendation that I feel is a trusted source, and I've seen it since then that the target window is while it's in bloom. So maybe the first half of while it's in bloom before it sets seed. You're welcome.
Can we use the mic? We're recording it. We're recording it. Thank you.
Okay. I notice you haven't said anything about the benefits of earthworms.
Yes.
And then my second question is to attract butterflies, hummingbirds in particular. Do you have any recommendations?
Okay, good questions. I'll see if I can get it. So my normal go-to, I couldn't figure out how to put my favorite hummingbird plant in here because it's a vine. Our native honeysuckle gets a bad rap. There's a lot of invasive honeysuckles, but we have a native honeysuckle vine, Lonicera sempervirens, and to me that thing blooms from April through November. I have 5 or 6 in my yard now, and I literally on a daily basis see hummingbirds flying from one vine to the other. My neighbors started planting them because they were enjoying the hummingbirds, so now there's 3 houses in a row with Lonicera sempervirens, the cultivar major wheeler, bright orange flowers, tubular flowers, great for attracting hummingbirds. Butterflies, I think butterflies is just the full package of lots of blooming plants with nectar, but I'll say that clethra and the mountain mint are 2 that really seem to attract butterflies in my yard. Earthworms, nowadays, there's the whole controversy with the Asian jumping worms mixing in with the earthworms. To me, I think that's where reducing chemical fertilizers from your property, right? Working without chemicals, planting lots of plants that feed the roots, feed the living organisms underneath. Even at Hillwood, when I used to manage a cutting garden, we stopped tilling because tilling destroys the integrity and structure of the soil. So moving into no tilling practices and such are all beneficial things for earthworms. But leaving your leaves probably is the number one thing, right? Because that's what's going to break down into rich, lovely soils. And it's all of that type of stuff that's working up and down into the system. It's the earthworms who are really what's tilling our soil naturally. So.
You mentioned a certain type of hydrangea,
Yeah.
native hydrangea. There's a lot of hydrangeas
Yeah.
around.
Yep.
So could you say something more about the various hydrangeas?
Perfect. A question is about types of hydrangeas that are native. First, I'll point out that at least in my yard, deer love the hydrangeas, but I really am only aware of two that are commonly available. It's the oak leaf hydrangea, and then the smooth hydrangea. And with that, I probably should have said earlier, I kind of use a wide geographical region for what I call native plants. I've never once seen an oak leaf hydrangea out in a natural land in the mid-Atlantic, but I think they're somewhere on the East Coast, right? Oak leaf hydrangeas are native. So to me, that's close enough. I particularly like the dwarfer cultivars of oak leaf hydrangeas, but it all depends on the space that you have. But big old oak leaf hydrangeas can be 8 to 10 feet tall and wide. Hydrangea arborescens, what you saw today was the straight species. A very common cultivar of hydrangea arborescens is the Annabelle. Do you all recognize Annabelle hydrangea? Those are the big white ones. But guess what? Annabelle is what I would call one of those bad cultivars of native plants because it's 100% sterile. What you saw was the picture, which is a lace cap flower, which has a lot of the sexual pollen and parts that attracts the pollinators. Annabelle has been hybridized by man to remove all the sexual parts, but put in hundreds of more petals. And the petals are what we see in our eyes, but they're not feeding the pollinators. Is that foliage still working as a support for, caterpillars and such? I believe so, yes. So, but there are lots of ways that, we can turn up or turn down the ecological value based on which plants we use.
Yes, sir.
You haven't mentioned bees.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that I haven't noticed bees this year in my garden.
Yeah.
And I'm really worried.
Yeah, I'm worried too. I think everybody is worried about bees. Big controversial subject. I'm not worried about European honeybees. They are not native bees. They're kind of grown like livestock. So it's like how we think of growing pigs for food is kind of how the honeybees situation is. To me, I'm worried about the thousands of native species of bees that we have. So putting in native plants and eliminating pesticides from the garden and leaving your stems upright over the winter time. Even for me, bees are particularly fans of like the bases of our warm season grasses. So we didn't have time today for me to go through my meta. We would be here. We'd still be in the depths of a presentation, right? But ornamental grasses that are native, when you chop those down, leaving your stems, right? So when I first started, I would chop everything down really, really low. And then I got to where, okay, I'll leave 3 or 4 inches. What's recommended is 8 to 12 inches of stems from previous years are allowed to be left up in your garden. It's actually 2-year stems, which actually create much better homes and habitats for overwintering insects, including bees. And then on top of, for bees in particular, those tight clumps of native grasses that when you chop them down and you still have this stump with a ton of old stems in it, that gives so much protection and space for bees to overwinter. Bees also want bare ground. So in my own yard, now there's places where the lawn doesn't grow. I don't mulch. It's just dirt. But you know what? Dirt is valuable habitat for a lot of different ground nesting bees where they're drilling their individual holes. So I think it's a big picture and involves a lot of different things going on, but native plants and sustainable maintenance, no pesticide, that goes a long way. Oh, please, no mosquito sprays. Oh, no. Mosquito sprays are just horrible. Yeah, don't.
I left the leaves and they blew all over my neighbor's yard.
Yep.
If I put a layer of mulch on top of the leaves, does that defeat the purpose?
No, I think that's maybe somewhere in between the two. So yeah, why not? So I think it depends on the square footage of your bed space at home versus your lawn and your hardscapes, right? Luckily at my own property, 75% of my space is now bed. So I have a lot of places to put a few extra leaves. I particularly like to, I will get out my little electric blower and push leaves around, right? And I tend to push more leaves underneath large shrubs or the backs of my borders and such. I don't let leaf litter stay on my little tiny dainty ground covers or my woodland phlox or my moss or even on the driveway. I'm still pushing leaves around too. I suppose a little bit of mulch on top just a light sprinkling and dusting would help hold them in place. And I would think it would be a fine component to doing that,
Yeah, I have a quick question, which is I know hardwood mulch is a bad word.
Yes.
What do you think about pine mulch?
Oh, yeah. So at Hillwood, I had never worked with pine fines before, but Hillwood convinced me that pine fines, if you're going to work with mulch, pine-based products, right? Hardwood is literally from the hard inner part of the wood, not as desirable as pine-based bark, like so pine bark mini nuggets or pine bark shredded, or even pine fines is the little tiny fine grade pine bark. That's actually used a lot as like a soil amendment, or you'll find it in soil conditioners. So yes, if I wanted to use a nice higher quality mulch, I would use pine something, but pine fines, number one way to go.
Thank you for all this. And we're pushing all these things that you're talking about, leaving the leaves, not burying your trees in mulch and leaving the stems, everything. One thing I just hoping you could talk about that we've been talking about on our committee is the soft landings.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about what that is and why it's important and how to do it?
Okay, so the question is soft landings. To me, I think of soft landings as the insects that are up in the trees. When they fall to the ground, are they going to fall on pavement? Are they going to fall on sidewalks or the lawn, right? All those are not good places. If again, your natural system, if you think before we paved everything over and put lawns in everywhere, the trees back in the day when the insects evolved, right? They would fall on leaf litter, assorted plantings, different layers of plantings, right? You'd fall from the oak onto the dogwood and then onto the leucothoe and then maybe onto a sedge, right? All of those things make the soft landings. And it's not just so much the landing falling down, it's that once you get down, you're amongst that tapestry of ground covers, that living mulch, right? Or you're amongst desirable places for you to hunker down and hide from everything that's out there in the world trying to get at you and to eat you, right? So lawn is not a good place to spend the winter hunkered down. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on soft landings? That's kind of my understanding.
No, I think that's great. Just
Yeah.
emphasize that you want butterflies and
Yeah.
caterpillars, moths, and everything
Yeah.
around your trees.
Yes.
Their plants
Yeah.
instead of mulching.
Yeah, hardwood mulch is also not the place, right? That's not a place. The lawn's not a place. Hardscape's not a place. It's what's natural is leaf litter, stems, sticks, rotting wood, right? Where you can get up underneath and hide in, and then plants. One last question, because this
Okay.
poor woman has been trying to ask from the start. Okay, ma'am.
I just wanted to say that I've been putting native plants in my yard for many years, and it's often really hard to find them.
Oh,
And so I thought maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah.
One of the good sources that I've found in recent years has been the county has sales through various parks and Brookside, et cetera.
Yep.
And then there are a couple of good mail order places as well. But
Yeah.
I thought maybe you could tell people, because it really is
Yeah.
hard to find.
So yeah, native
Find
plant
them.
sources. Do you have a list? There's a lovely list there.
We have a handout on that.
Nice.
Thank you for that good question. Good
Yeah.
question.
Also post on the listserv. Information on all the handouts, including that one.
And I'll add one source. There's a blogger, local blogger. Her website's called nutsfornatives.com.
That's on my list.
Oh, perfect. Nuts for Natives is a go-to. She
Well,
lists all the different places in our region that you can get native plants.
That was great. We learned a lot more from your Q&As. Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions.